Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Now, in our previous lecture, we covered the simple things about growth. We started a discussion on growth. We defined the different measures of growth, the aggregate measure that was real GDP growth rate, then the per capita real income, real per capita GDP growth rate, and then we looked at the different drivers or possible causes or sources of growth, that is, changes in the underlying factors of production. Now, that was the easy stuff that we covered yesterday. Today, we'll have the harder part of contending with the two growth theories, that is, exogenous growth theory and endogenous growth theory. And we'll hopefully conclude that just in time for us to be able to start discussion about the interrelationships between the four macroeconomic problems that we've discussed so far: inflation, unemployment, balance of payments problems, and growth. Now, let's start with exogenous growth theory. Exogenous growth theory basically is associated with the neoclassical view on growth, which was quite dominant in growth thinking till the 1980s, when endogenous growth theory took over. Exogenous growth theory simply said that it was not possible for an economy to grow at a fast rate just because it was accumulating more and more capital. That is, as the capital in any economy increased, the diminishing returns to capital would ensure that the long-run growth rate of the economy would fall or subside to the growth rate of population. So that the aggregate growth in the GDP, the real GDP of an economy, would be equal to the growth rate of population, or at best the growth rate of population plus the technical progress rate or the technical advancement rate of that economy. And both these rates were exogenous, that is, beyond the control of policymakers. Therefore, the major implication of exogenous growth theory was that policymakers cannot affect the long-run growth rate of any economy. That was a pretty powerful view, quite an extreme one, has been nuanced since. But let's first develop how this view could be formalized in the context of a theoretical model. We'll have to start with the production function for the economy, and we'll use the Cobb-Douglas production function, the key features of which are: one, that there are diminishing returns to factors, that is, you'll have capital and labor in the function, and we'll show how the function is such that there are diminishing returns to those individual factors. That is, partial y over partial k is a decreasing function. Similarly, partial y over partial l is decreasing. And then we will see that the production function has constant returns to scale. That is, if you increase both labor and capital by 10%, output would increase by 10%. So let's start by looking at what this production function is, what the marginal conditions are, and how it gives rise to these very powerful views in that the long-term growth rate of the economy is determined exogenously and is equal to the growth rate of the population, which we will call n in this case. Let's start with our series of slides. We're going to have a number of slides in the first 35 minutes. It's going to be packed, so pay attention. Don't lose me in the middle. Let's go to our first slide. Now, the production function that was used to develop the neoclassical exogenous growth model was a Cobb-Douglas constant returns to scale production function. And this is simply represented by capital Y equals A k to the power alpha, L to the power 1 minus alpha, where alpha is a parameter which is between 0 and 1. Now, A here stands for the level of technical knowledge in the economy. We introduced the concept of technical know-how or technical knowledge of the economy. A represents an exogenously given level of technology in the economy. K stands for capital, the stock of capital, and L stands for the size of the labor force, and Y is the aggregate real GDP or output. Now, two things to note about this production function. It's a constant returns to scale production function, and I'd like you to go home and experiment with this. just pick arbitrary values for A, K, L, and alpha, and then increase K and L by the same proportion, let's say by 10%, and see what the new Y comes out to, right? And you will notice that the percentage increase in Y will be the same as the percentage increase in each of K and L. And this would be an example of a constant returns to scale production function. If you notice, the production function will give diminishing returns to factors, and we can see this by looking at the marginal conditions, that is by looking at how output responds to changes in capital. So if you derive dy by dk, or more exactly partial y by partial k, that is the partial derivative of y with respect to k, keeping L and other variables constant, you will get A times alpha k to the power alpha minus 1 L to the power 1 minus alpha. And this right hand side is now falling in k. It's a falling function because alpha minus 1 is less than 0, that is it's negative, and therefore as k increases, the slope, that is dy by dk, falls. Similarly, if you calculate partial y by partial L, that is the returns to increasing quantities of labor, you will get A k to the power alpha multiplied by 1 minus alpha times L raised to the power minus alpha. And this again is falling in L, because as L increases, L to the minus alpha falls, and therefore dy over dl, or partial y over partial L, falls. Therefore, the diminishing returns to factors assumption is borne out, or is proved by these two partial derivatives. Note that production function, whose two features are that it is a constant returns to scale production function and has diminishing returns to factors, can be represented in per capita terms as well. So you could have small y equals to A small k to the power alpha, which would give the relationship between per capita output and per capita capital. So you've divided both sides by L. Let's see how this per capita production function obtains, because this is really the production function that we will be looking at as we take our discussion forward. Let's go back to our slide. So if you take the production function, which is in aggregate terms, and divide both sides by L, capital L, then you will get y over L is equals to A k to the power alpha times L raised by 1 minus alpha whole over L. Now you can break L into two parts, L raised to the power alpha times L raised to the power 1 minus alpha. And as you know, the powers can add and they will give you 1. So this is equivalent. L alpha multiplied by L raised to the power 1 minus alpha is the same thing as simple L. So now if you take the L to the power alpha and put it below k to the power alpha, and then take L1 minus alpha and put it below L1 minus alpha, you can simply write the production function as small y is equal to capital A times small k to the power alpha, and the L term simply disappears, cancels out, where small y stands for per capita output and small k stands for capital per person. Now once we have this very simple but powerful relationship between small y and small k, we can think about changes in per capita capital that can cause changes in per capita output. So if we can find ways to increase per capita capital, then that will translate into changes in per capita output. However, note that because alpha is less than 1, as small k increases further and further, the increase in small y will be not as great, it will fall, and this reflects the diminishing returns embedded in the production function. Now the way to proceed in this setup is to see how the capital stock, the per capita capital stock changes. That is, how can a small k change over time? And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, changes in small k can occur because of capital deepening. So if there is more capital per person per laborer, then small k will rise, whereas if there is less capital per laborer, then small k will fall. Now, naturally, the investment that is required to keep a small k constant, that is to keep capital to labor constant, depends on, that is, we're talking about capital widening here, depends on the growth rate of the labor force. If the labor force is sort of growing at a very fast rate, then more and more amounts of capital need to be produced or needs to be produced in order to maintain a constant capital to labor ratio. So in this context, one thing is certain, that capital widening, or the amount of capital that needs to be produced just to maintain a constant small k, increases with the growth rate of the population, which we've assumed in this case as given exogenously at small n. The other factor which determines the amount of capital that needs to be produced in order to maintain k over L constant is the level of small k itself. The higher is small k, that is, if k over L is, let's say, 20, that is 20 units of capital per laborer, then naturally you will need more and more capital in order to ensure that that high ratio remains the same. If the ratio were, let's say, 2:1, then you would need smaller increments in capital to maintain that ratio. So naturally, the amount of investment that needs to ensure that capital widening happens and helps maintain a constant capital to labor ratio depends on the multiple of n and k, small n and small k. So that's the increase in capital which is going towards capital widening. But the total capital accumulation that is happening in the economy would simply be the proportion of output that is saved and invested, right? You can do two things with your total output. You can either consume it or you can save it. And we assume in this case that saving equals investment and helps build capital. So the total amount of income is small y, and the part that is saved is small s of that. So sy, small s times y, where s represents the savings rate, and this is also assumed as exogenously given, sy gives the total amount of capital accumulation that is happening. Let's now see how these two things, the sy, which is the total capital accumulation, and the nk, which is the amount required to ensure that capital to labor ratio remains the same, give rise to changes in the capital deepening part of changes in k. So let's look at how that happens, how k dot evolves as the level of capital increases. Now, total capital accumulation, as I said, was equal to small s times y. But y is simply a times k to the power alpha. Therefore, total capital accumulation is equal to small s times a times small k to the power alpha. Now, of this, the amount that is going to capital widening, that is to maintain capital to labor ratio constant, is equal to small n times small k. Whereas the amount that is left over for capital deepening, that is to drive changes in small k, and we denote that by k dot, where k dot is simply dk by dt, that is the rate of change of small k over time, that would be given by the difference between the total capital accumulation and the amount of that is taken up by capital widening. So it will be S A K alpha minus small n times small k. Now, as you can see, as k increases, k dot will fall. You can put some figures in there and see that as you increase k on the right hand side and you have arbitrary values of S, A and n given, then k dot will gradually fall. Eventually, k dot will become 0, and this will happen when S A k to the alpha is equal to n k. This is called the steady state level of capital. That is, this is the level at which the per capita capital becomes constant. What is this level in terms of the level of capital? You can simply solve the equation and get k star is equal to S A over n whole to the power 1 over 1 minus alpha. Now, the important thing to note here is that when k dot is equal to 0, it means that d capital K over L by dt is equal to 0. That is, the rate of change of capital to labor over time is equal to 0, because that is simply what small k is. Small k is simply capital K over L. But this in fact means that the rate of growth of capital and labor are constant. That is, if you multiply k by 1.05, that is, if capital grows by 5%, then labor also has to grow by 5% in order to deliver the same capital to labor ratio. This means that capital K is growing at the same rate as L, and we have assumed the rate at which the population is growing, that is small n. Therefore, we can write that G capital K is equal to small n, where Gk is equal to dk over dt over k, when n is equal to dl over dt over L. Now, if you go back to the old production function, the aggregate production function, we can calculate the rate of growth for capital Y, and that can simply be computed as d capital Y over dt over L is equal to 0 plus alpha gk plus 1 minus alpha gl, and if you plug the figures for gk and gl in there, you will get n. So the rate of growth of capital Y is equal to small n, and this is exogenously given. Now let me summarize what we did there, because that was the hardest part of the lecture. We first transformed the aggregate production function into a per capita production function. So we converted y, capital Y is equal to a k to the power alpha L to the power 1 minus alpha into small y is equal to a to the power small a multiplied by k to the power alpha, small k. Then we looked at the increments in k that would be going towards capital widening and the increments that would be going towards capital deepening, where capital deepening is the rate of change of small k. That is, if the capital to labor ratio is changing, the per capita capital is changing. And we saw that the total amount of capital that was being accumulated would be equal to small s times y, which is the total saving that is happening in the economy, which is then invested through the loanable funds market, if you remember. And that a part of that just goes towards capital widening, that is to keep the capital to labor ratio constant, that is to keep small k constant. That part was nk. So we subtract nk from from sy in order to get the k dot, or the capital deepening part of increments to capital. And we obtained a k dot equation which was simply sa k to the power alpha minus nk. And we saw that in this equation, as k increased, k dot gradually fell until k dot became 0 and then became negative after that. Now the point of interest here is the point at which k dot becomes equal to 0, because that represents the steady state of the economy. That is the point at which the capital to labor ratio becomes constant. And the neoclassical growth intuition here was that at this point, where k dot is equal to 0, the growth rate of aggregate output in the economy is equal to small n. And we showed how that was the case. We said that when small k and the rate of change in small k was equal to 0, that simply meant that both capital K and L were growing at the same rate. But this had the implication of generating a growth rate for capital Y which was also equal to small n. That is, when we took the logs of the aggregate production function and generated the growth equation, we got gy is equal to alpha times the growth rate of capital K plus 1 minus alpha times the growth rate of labor. And when we put the values in there, we got n as the answer, which was the growth rate of aggregate output. And this was a pretty powerful argument that the growth rate of aggregate output in the steady state of the economy, or in the stable state of the economy, is determined by the exogenous rate of growth of population. That is, the government can't do anything about it. If the government can increase the rate of growth of population, it would increase aggregate GDP growth. But note that we're not talking about what's happening to per capita GDP growth. Per capita GDP growth is stable in the steady state. That is, capital Y over L is equal to a constant value in the steady state. It's the aggregate y which is changing at the same rate at the as the aggregate L, and the aggregate L is changing at n, small n, therefore aggregate y is also changing at small n. Now there are three possible inferences that one can draw from this analysis, and these were basically the essence of the argument that the neoclassical exogenous growth theory people presented. And those were that saving will have no effect on the steady state growth rate. The steady state growth rate was, as you saw, small n, and they said that any increase in the saving rate, the small s that we used, will not cause an increase in the steady state growth rate or the long run growth rate of the economy. So that means that just by increasing the level of saving in the economy, by increasing the level of capital accumulation, you could not ensure that the economy would grow forever. And this was consistent with the diminishing returns argument. That is, as more and more capital is accumulated, diminishing returns set in, and therefore the economy simply just can't grow on the basis of that. The second main argument that was flowing from the neoclassical growth theory was that the determinants of growth are beyond us, that we can't impact, public policy can't impact the growth rate of the economy. And this meant that we could simply sort of sit down with one hand over the other and not worry about growth. Growth would happen independently. And the third a hypothesis that was put forward by neoclassical economists was that of convergence. Convergence simply meant that countries with a higher level of small k, that is a higher level of per capita capital and consequently per capita output or income, would converge to the level of capital or small k of countries which had lower levels of capital per capita. And the argument there was that beyond a certain point, that is beyond a point where k dot was equal to 0, if your capital of small k was higher than that, then k dot would be negative, and therefore your capital to labor ratio would fall until it comes back to k star. Whereas countries which had k dot is equal to, is positive, that is, which had smaller levels of small k, would experience faster growth, and they would move to the same level, which is k star, which is where the steady state of the economy would be achieved. So countries which have higher capital to labor ratios will grow slowly, and countries which have smaller capital to output ratios will grow faster, and eventually they will catch up and converge at the point where you have k star, that is when k dot is equal to 0. Let's illustrate these three points, that is the fact that saving does not affect the long-term steady-state growth rate of the economy, that is the exogenously determined n means that we cannot affect the growth rate of the economy, and thirdly, this convergence hypothesis. Let's look at these graphically and see how we can see if this was actually happening and if actual evidence fit this graphical illustration or not. Now here we have a graph where small y is plotted against small k. Small y is on the vertical axis and small k is on the horizontal axis. And if we plot the production function small y is equal to a small k to the power alpha, it would plot as a concave function, which is shown here by small y. Now when you save a part of that output, that is, if you want to know what the total capital accumulation is, then you would multiply y with a proportion, that is s, small s. That is, s would be a proportion of total y. It was something like 0.2, 0.15, 0.3. That's the amount that you save. And therefore you will get a total capital accumulation line represented by small s times y, which is a curve which has the same shape as y but is lower. That is, there is a vertical downward displacement, and this represents the fact that saving is a proportion of y. Now note the line small n times small k, which plots as an upward sloping straight line. It's an upward sloping straight line because n is a constant, and therefore any function of k which has a constant slope plots as a straight line. and n is usually assumed to be positive. That is, we assume that the population is growing at a positive rate. So this nk reflects the amount of capital which is required, that is the capital widening requirement of the economy, that is the amount of capital accumulation that must be devoted to keeping small k constant. Now the steady state equilibrium of the economy would happen when nk intersected small sy, that is at point E. And this is because at this point there is no capital deepening happening. All of the capital accumulation is going towards keeping the small k constant. And that is at this point k dot, that is the rate of change of small k is 0 because small k is constant. So if we plot the graph for small k dot, it would plot as again a concave function but an upward sloping one, and then after a turning point it intersects the x-axis at k star. So k star is the point at which k dot would be equal to 0, and this corresponds to the point E, which is the intersection point of sy and nk. If we take it up vertically and see where this line intersects the y function, we can get the equivalent equilibrium or steady state level of per capita income, which is y star. Now let's illustrate what happens when the saving rate increases from S to S prime, that is a higher saving rate. Well, all that will happen is that the economy would move, the steady state equilibrium point of the economy would move from E to F, and the dk over dt, that is k dot line, would be shifted to the right, and we would get a new level of equilibrium or steady state small k, that is k double star, and the corresponding level of output would be, per capita output would be y double star. But note that in the steady state, k dot is still equal to 0. That is, the steady state happens when the rate of change in small k is equal to 0, when big K is growing at the same rate as L. And this means that capital Y is growing at the same rate as K and L, that is at the rate of N. Note that while the steady state growth rate of capital Y for both cases, that is when equilibrium is at E or F, is the same as small n, the level of per capita output is different for both cases. That is, the level of per capita output when the saving rate is SY or saving rate is S is Y star, whereas the level of capital equilibrium or steady state per capita output is Y double star for the S prime saving rate case. This is usually called the levels effect. That is, the increase in savings rate from S to S prime has had an increase in the level of Y, Y star. That is, the per capita output has increased in levels, but the growth rate of output has not changed. The growth rate of real GDP or capital Y is still N. That is, whether you save S or whether you save S prime. So we see how graphically we can picture the economy growing at a steady state growth rate of small n, whether the saving rate is higher or smaller. And this was a pretty powerful argument that the neoclassical exogenous growth theorists presented, that we could not affect the long-run steady state growth rate of any economy. That would be equal to the growth rate of the labor force. That was one. Let's now look at the convergence hypothesis, that is, whether the convergence theory presented by neoclassical economists was correct or not, and whether it could be presented graphically or not. Let's go back to our slide. Now, as you can see, we again have small y on the vertical axis and k on the horizontal axis, and we plot the same functions again. We have the accumulation function, which is S A k to the alpha, and we have the depreciation line or the capital widening line, which is n times k. Now, if you plot the k dot function in this graph, then you will get the k dot function intersecting the x-axis at 2 points, one at k1 and one at k2. Now, the convergence hypothesis came into play in the region around k2. The argument was that if you are to the right of point k2, then your capital to labor ratio, that is your per capita capital level, will be falling. That is, K dot would be negative, and therefore you would converge back to K2. You would grow more slowly or even negatively, and therefore you would come back to point K2. Whereas if you were to the left of point K2, then K dot would be positive. That is, as you can see in the graph is above the zero line, the x-axis. And therefore K would gradually increase, and therefore you would move to the right. That is, you would move towards the point K2, and therefore economies which were on either side of the point K2 would gradually converge on K2. And the equilibrium would be struck at the point where NK and SAK alpha, the two lines, intersected. However, note that convergence would not happen if an economy started at a capital level which was below K1. That is, let's say at a capital level of K naught. If it started there, then at that point the K dot would already be negative, and therefore you would move in a leftward direction on the x-axis, and therefore you would move towards 0. That is, you would not move towards K2 in that case, and in this case the poorer economies would not catch up with the richer economies. That is, economies with a lower small k would not catch up with the economies with a larger small k. So we saw there, my friends, that if an economy started at a point below K1, that is to the left of K1, it would not converge to the point K2. And this explained the difference between empirical realities and the arguments put forward by the neoclassical growth economists. They said that poor and rich economies would converge over time automatically, because the poorer economies would grow faster and the richer economies would grow slower. But as we saw, that you need a critical level of starting per capita capital in order to ensure that you do actually converge to the point K2, and that level was greater than equal to K1. That threshold was defined as greater than or equal to small K1. So that helped explain why some poor countries in the world are never catching up or cannot catch up with the rich countries of the world. And indeed, if you look around you, poor countries in Africa, in South Asia, have not been able to catch up with the richer countries like the US or European countries. The difference in the living standards between rich and poor countries has increased, not reduced, over time. That is, richer countries are getting richer and poorer countries are getting poorer. And therefore, the convergence hypothesis is not found empirically to hold. But through this particular argument, that is, if you are below the level K1, then you would not converge, you could still justify that the neoclassical growth model held and could explain reality. The other point was that the neoclassical growth model could not explain was the major fact that the world income levels or countries' levels of aggregate income have not grown at N, that is the growth rate of their population. That is the ratio of output or income to labor, that is the per capita income level of countries, has not remained stagnant over time. And that many rich countries have experienced massive increases or improvements in living standards reflected in large changes in per capita income levels. And we saw that these were 27 times, Japan witnessed a 27 times increase in per capita income from 1870 to 1999. Now, you could not explain these things within the neoclassical growth model, because in that model, per capita income was constant and that aggregate output was only growing at the rate of growth of population. But how could this be reconciled when the argument that was presented was that technical progress is also happening? Note that in our earlier example, we took A as constant. A was the level of technical knowledge in the economy, and we took that as constant. But if you include a rate of growth for A, then that adds to the rate of growth of output. And the algebra of that is included in your lecture handouts. You can see how any technology which augments the ability of the labor force to become more efficient and to become more productive automatically increases the equilibrium or steady state growth rate of aggregate GDP, real GDP. That is, if the labor rate growth rate is small n, and technical progress which augments the laborer's ability to work or their efficiency is t, then the overall growth rate of the aggregate GDP would be n plus t, and this t would explain the difference or the increase in living standards that have been witnessed in many advanced economies. But the main problem with this conclusion was that both small n and small t were exogenous growth rates. That is, they were taken as determined outside the model. And economists did not like that. They wanted something which was endogenous to the model. They wanted to see the growth rate responding to things that the government could do. They wanted the growth rate to be seen as responding to firms behaving or firms investing in R&D. And this wasn't permitted within the neoclassical model because both the growth rate of the labor force, that is N, and the growth rate in technology or technical know-how, T, were assumed to happen outside of the model, or that is, they were taken as given and that the government could not affect them. And if the government could affect them, then the model did not offer any insights on how that would translate into growth, right? So this was a major criticism of the neoclassical growth theory, and this criticism heightened in the early 1980s and prompted and started a whole new literature on growth, which we now know as endogenous growth theory. Now, endogenous growth theory basically was premised on the non-diminishing returns to factor assumption. That is, earlier we said that the classical, neoclassical version, the exogenous growth model, assumed diminishing returns to factor. That is, when a firm or an economy accumulated more and more capital, the returns in terms of output to that capital fell because the production function was a concave function, that is, had diminishing returns to factors. But this assumption was dropped by the people who started the literature on endogenous growth. And they said that it is possible for capital to have diminishing returns at the firm level, but to have non-diminishing or constant returns to capital at the aggregate economic level or the aggregate economy level. And the arguments were quite simple. They said that when one firm increases its capital stock, it runs into or bangs into diminishing returns. But as the level of capital of the whole of the economy increases, then there are externalities to that. That is, as the capital level of the whole of the economy increases, then there are spillovers between firms. Firms exchange their know-how, the way in which they use their capital, and therefore it is not necessary for the economy as a whole to experience diminishing returns to capital. And this simple change in assumption, but which had a very drastic change in terms of the implications of the model, was presented in the form of a simple model which is called the AK model, and which is simply written as small y is equal to capital A times small k. Let's see how endogenous growth or the channels for endogenous growth can be identified by using this model. Let's go to a slide. So we start with a model which is the AK model, where you have small y is equal to capital A times small k. Note that there is no alpha here, and therefore there are no diminishing returns to factor. That is, as k increases, y increases. Partial y over partial k is constant. That this means constant returns to factors, not constant returns to scale, constant returns to factor. Now, what would be the total capital accumulation in this case? It would be the same, Sy, in this case equals to Sak, because y is simply Ak. Of this total capital accumulation, how much is going to capital widening? It's again equal to Nk. And how much is going to capital deepening? That is represented by K dot or dk over dt. And that would be Sak minus Nk equals Sa minus N in brackets multiplied by small k. Now, if you take the small k to the other side, you will get the rate of growth in small k, that is K dot over K is equal to small s times A minus N. Now note that y is equal to ak. So if you calculate the growth rate in small y, you can first take logarithms of both sides. Ln y is equal to ln a plus ln k. That will give you y dot over y, that is the growth rate in small y, equals k dot over k, that is the growth rate in small k. And since small y is equal to capital Y over L, then the growth rate in small y is equal to growth rate in capital Y minus growth rate in L, which gives growth rate in capital Y equals growth rate in small y plus growth rate in L. Now the growth rate in small y is simply equal to y dot over y, which in this case is equal to k dot over k, which is equal to SA minus n. Therefore, if we plug SA minus n in place of g small y in this equation, we get g capital Y is equal to SA minus n plus n, which is the growth rate of labor, to get SA. Therefore, the growth rate of real GDP, the growth rate of Y, capital Y, is equal to SA. Note that the growth rate in capital Y is now equal to small s times a. The growth rate is now dependent on the saving rate and the level of technological know-how. So any increase in the saving rate would permanently increase the long run or steady state growth rate of the economy. Similarly, any increase in the level of technology will impact the long run steady state growth rate of the economy. And this is now a much more interesting result than the result that we earlier had, where we said that the long run steady state growth rate cannot be impacted by the savings rate. So now you can see that when you have the steady state long run growth rate of the economy depending on things like the saving rate, you have a role for public policy. That is, any increase in the saving rate can cause permanent increases in the growth rate of the economy, and this would arise because of non-diminishing returns to capital. In this case, we've assumed that the returns to capital are not diminishing because partial y over partial k was equal to a. But the argument also holds for other types of factors of production. There could be non-diminishing returns to labor because of the improvements in human capital. As more and more people get education and the level of education in the economy goes up, then there might be non-diminishing returns to that, and that might cause permanent increases in the growth rate of income. So clearly, much more interesting policy insights emerging from this kind of endogenous growth approach, and the only difference, as you can see, was the assumption about diminishing returns to capital or diminishing returns to any factor of production. In the neoclassical model, you assumed diminishing returns. Here you assumed non-diminishing returns. So my friends, with that, your torture is over. आपकी मुसीबत खत्म हुई. हमारा जो growth का segment था वो इख्तिताम पज़ीर हुआ. It was quite tough. There was a lot of mathematics in there, some very different types of graphical illustrations, which some of you might think did not make matters simpler, but complicated them. But the idea is just to tell you about what economic analysis would look like if you proceed to the third year of undergraduate or to graduate levels. Some of the skills, some of the mathematical tools that economists employ, things like K dot, things like growth rates and connecting different growth rates together, things like those diagrams that we looked at, and how the K dot diagram related to the movements in K along the horizontal axis. So I hope that at least some of you found it interesting and develop a feel for it. Go through the mathematics again that I've included in the lecture handouts. It's quite elegant once you go through it, and I think if you grasp it or become on top of it, that it will help you in your future study of economics. Maybe it's not so relevant for the exam, at least the mathematics part of it. The intuition is more important for the exam. But it would be useful for you personally just to go through the mathematics and understand that you know the ways in which the neoclassical arguments are emerging and the endogenous growth theorists are putting forward their case. So that, my friends, concludes our discussion on growth. Our next topic is the relationship between these four issues that we've talked about. Remember that we've talked about unemployment, we've talked about inflation, we've talked about balance of payments, and we've talked about very in-depth level about growth. And it's also useful to develop an understanding of how these four objectives or these four issues that policymakers face are related to one another. Now, we will use three approaches to show how these variables are, or these issues are related to each other. The first one is by using the trade cycle. Note that I introduced the trade cycle in our previous lecture when I illustrated the different phases that an economy goes through, that is boom, recession, upturn, downturn, etc., and the relationship between actual and potential GDP. We can use the same trade cycle to illustrate the relationship between these four variables very nicely. Then we will look at a direct method in which we will look at these different combinations. We will look at unemployment growth, we look at balance of payments, inflation, and we'll use that to develop an intuition of what could be the causal links between some of these issues. And finally, we look at a Salter-Swan diagram which helps illustrate these relationships and the policy implications arising from what combination a particular economy is stuck in. That is, if an economy faces unemployment and balance of payments problems together, what are the ways in which it can come out of those problems. So those are the three approaches that we will look at. Let's start with the trade cycle and see how the four problems are related and can be seen to be related through the trade cycle. Let's go and take a look at our trade cycle. Now, as you can see, this is the same kind of trade cycle reproduced here. You have potential output, which provides the ceiling for actual output. And then you have a trade cycle which has points 1, 2, 3, 4, where point 3 is a boom point, whereas you have high output, low unemployment, but high inflation. That is, we are in a Keynesian world. That is, when you have low unemployment, you have high inflation, that is a pressure on prices. But at this point, you also have a current account deficit, and this, as you remember, is being derived from that relationship between income and imports. As you know, as income increases, your demand for imports increases, and therefore your M increases and X minus M goes down, and that's equivalent to a current account deficit. So point 3 is a point where output is high, unemployment is low, inflation is high, and the current account is in deficit. Compare this with point 1 where you have a recession. Here you are likely to have a low level of inflation. You're likely to have a current account surplus because the output is low and therefore the demand for imports is low. Also, you're likely to have a high unemployment rate because output is low and the full employment level of the economy is not being achieved. Therefore, 1 gives the combination of low inflation, low output, a current account surplus, and high unemployment. Now, let's see how these things change as we move along the trade cycle. Now, in the expansionary phase of the trade cycle, that is phase 2, aggregate demand grows rapidly. The gap between actual and potential output narrows. There will be relatively rapid growth in output, and demand-deficient unemployment will fall. Thus, 2 of the problems will be solved, that is, of growth and of unemployment. On the other hand, the other 2 problems will be getting worse. The growing shortages, that is, the excess of demand over supply, will lead to higher demand pull inflation, and the current account of the balance of payments will go into deficit as the extra demand sucks in or falls on more imports. Now, at the peak of the cycle, that is phase 3, unemployment is probably at its lowest and output is at its highest, that is for the time being at least. But growth has already ceased or at least slowed down. Inflation and balance of payments problems are quite acute at this stage. That is, inflation will be high and the balance of payments will be in deficit because the demand for imports is quite high. Now, as the economy moves into phase 4, the recession that is, the reverse will happen to that of phase 2. Falling aggregate demand will make growth negative and demand deficient unemployment higher. But inflation is likely to slow down and the current account balance of payments will improve. Note that the government is faced with a dilemma. Government के लिए बड़ा मुश्किल मरहला है. If it tries to reflate the economy, that is, inject some demand into the economy by increasing government spending or reducing taxes, then it can solve two of the problems, that of unemployment and low growth. But it will create two other problems, that of inflation and balance of payments problems. Similarly, if it tries to deflate the economy, that is by reducing government spending or increasing taxes, then it might solve the problem of balance of payments and inflation, but might create the problems of unemployment and output growth. So pretty difficult for the government to decide where to strike the balance. There are strict trade-offs to be taken care of. We will discuss these further in the context of direct relationships between these variables. You remember we talked about the relationship, the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. We look at the other 5 trade-offs that are possible between these 4 issues. And then we will also look at the policy options that can be talked about in the context of a very nice Salter-Swan diagram. So my friends, with that we come to the end of today's lecture. We've concluded our discussion on growth, very rigorous, very mathematical, very graph intensive. I hope some of you enjoyed it and that you will go through the mathematical appendices that I've included in the notes. It's the intuition which is important for the exam, but I generally think it'll be good for you if you can follow the mathematics. Now that we have started discussion about these interactions between the 4 issues, we will be able to conclude it in our next lecture and then start looking at fiscal policy and monetary policy in a little bit of more detail. So till our next lecture, it's Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.